both. You don't have to, and you could still get full points if you take only the one. But if you do want to show us that that you have ideas for a final paper and you still want to take a final exam, you can. You're able to do that. We have also scheduled the speakers for the next couple of weeks. If you got an email, that's great. If you still want to present but haven't told us, you're more than welcome to tell us, and we'll fit you in some of our sessions. We will have a couple of presentations today from the TAs, and we will also, we'll have a video with Professor Clark and some slides that he will go over. So that's sort of the plan for today. We will also have outside speakers next week, so it's going to be exciting. If you come to class, that would be great. Can we have a question over here?
Yeah, if you decide to do both the final
yeah.
paper, is there still does the final paper have to be 20 pages or whatever the length was on Canvas? I forget the exact.
Right. Professor Clark, maybe you can answer that question?
Yeah, I didn't have the question clear.
Yeah, so Marcos mentioned that you can do both the final paper and the final exam, but if you decide to do both, does the final paper have to be a certain length? Like, what's the minimum length for the final paper?
If it's a paper, final paper, filed together final, the answer to that question, we've been asked the same question 25 times in the last weeks. The answer is read the syllabus. It says that the paper is 20 pages, double spaced. Shorter than that can be memos, but if it's a paper, it has to be that length. Okay. The reason for both is that if you say you have, several people have said, I made a mistake, I forgot something, I don't think I did a good job on the midterm, what can I do to improve my grade? This is the answer. Okay? So, if you do more things and you have a bad day, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And if 1 and 2, you're doing more work. Each time you do more work, that is participation. An exam is participation, and as well as the paper, obviously, as well as discussion here in person, as well as posting knowledge. These are all showing that you're reading, you're using, you're thinking about the ideas in the course. And if you show us that in concrete manner, you will improve your grade. Simple as that. Okay. We don't have exact weights because you get over 100%. But that is, you'll get over 100% if you include the paper and the 2 exams. And so that will simply say you're more likely to get a higher grade. Anything else on that? But basically, that's the story. Okay. Do we have 2 student presentations today as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what if we let them go first? And
okay.
I'll talk afterwards.
Okay.
Okay.
I can start if you want.
Okay. No, great.
All right.
Or if you're TV. Okay, great.
Okay. Okay. So I have a short presentation. Oh yeah. On the work that I've been doing for my MA thesis, which is still in its in a sort of initial stage. So please don't attack me that much, or do attack me. If that will improve my thesis.
Productive suggestions and criticism. Most valuable thing in the university and intellectual life is productive criticism.
Of course, as long as it's productive. So my thesis is going to be on the relationship between the opioid crisis and voting patterns, particularly in the state of Illinois. So I'm a student in the concentration of geographic information science, and the goal for me, the methodological goal, is for me to apply the techniques of spatial analysis that I've been working on for the past quarters into an MA thesis. So this is the topic that I chose. Just a brief overview about the opioid crisis itself. This is a major public health issue that has turned into an epidemic some years from now. In 2018, the opioid crisis took the lives of 47,000 people alone, only in 2018. And there has been some discussion on what exactly the causes of this problem are. On the sort of supply side, the literature says that there might be a rising tide of despair among less educated middle-aged Americans, which is causing them to become addicted to opioids. On the demand side, some people argue that because opioids are more easily available and produced, and there is a rise in prescription rates on the part of doctors, this is also fueling the crisis. But in any case, both explanations involve a clear increase in chronic pain, because the reason why opioid medication is prescribed is because someone has a lot of pain, which can then cause problems in itself. In relation to electoral outcomes, there has some research has been done. A higher share of the vote for President Trump in the 2016 election was associated to a higher rate of opioid prescription at the county level. There is also some evidence that higher opioid prescription rates at the congressional district level are associated with more votes for Republicans, and that is with districts that are more Republican leaning than the mean. But there's still research to be done at the lower level, at the county level, and also at the county level for subnational officials, such as governors. Because the causes of the opioid crisis are still debated, knowledge on the specific places that are hit the hardest could provide information that is useful for identifying the population that we need to target in order to solve the crisis, basically. So, the case of Illinois, well, why Illinois? It would be ideal to take probably the whole of the United States. The problem is that it's not exactly easy to find normalized data for all 50 states. So I have picked Illinois because my data sources are great, honestly. The rate of drug overdose deaths in Illinois is almost exactly the same as that of the U.S. as a whole. The location of Illinois is useful because it has been suggested that this type of despair has hit the Midwest harder than other regions. Remember back in 2016, for example, a lot of Midwestern states, actually all of the ones that share a border with Illinois, except for Illinois, voted for Trump, even though these tended to be more Democratic-leaning states. The electoral history of Illinois also mirrors national patterns pretty closely. We have a major urban area, which is Chicago, which has traditionally leaned Democratic and tends to vote in increasing numbers for Democratic candidates, while the rural areas have been a stronghold for Republicans. But in terms of governorship, even though Illinois has voted for Democratic presidential nominees for a number of elections now, in terms of the governorship, the office remains competitive. And out of the last 8 races, Republicans and Democrats have won each 4. So there is going to be variation in the dependent variable, which is so important when doing research. So far, what I've done is I have produced a lot of statistics and maps. These are sort of the most interesting ones. So we have 4 standard deviation maps. What they're showing is how counties relate to the mean of the variable that is being measured. On the top left, we have vote for the change in the vote for Governor Rauner between 2014 and 2018. Browner was a Republican. Then on the top right, we have the difference between 2014 and 2018 in the vote for Republican congressional candidates. And on the bottom, we have on the left the difference in fatal opioid overdoses in the same time period. And on the right, what we have are basically the same statistic for non-fatal opioid overdoses. The reason why I'm taking both kinds of opioid overdoses is because I hypothesize that there may be a different kind of impact, especially in rural places where overdoses are fatal. Because if they are, that could send sort of a stronger shock to the community in rural areas where people tend to tend to have stronger relationships with people rather than in the city. But that may also not be the case. So what we're seeing here is some interesting patterns. There's definitely what in GIS is called some degree of spatial autocorrelation, meaning that the patterns shown here are not random, especially for electoral outcomes. We see that between 2014 and 2018, Republicans have fared pretty bad in northern Illinois compared to southern Illinois. But for Browner, this governor, the former governor now, this is a different story. In western Illinois, he did much worse in 2018 than in 2014, relative to other parts of the state. So what I've done is I've run some statistics, which honestly are kind of disappointing so far, because I found that the spatial relationship between opioid overdoses and a higher share of the vote for incumbent governor is weak. So what was my idea? My idea was that if the governor could show that he was taking matters seriously, and then he was taking steps toward solving the crisis, or helping to solve the crisis, and voters could potentially reward this. So the background for this theory is the theory called retrospective voting, a theory in political science which says basically that voters hold office holders accountable for what they do. This has been studied in relation to the economy, to crime rates, to poverty, but not in relation to health, public health matters, as far as I'm concerned. There is a stronger relationship between opioid overdoses and a higher share of vote for Republican congressional candidates, similar to what the literature has found. And results for NME rates, these are milligrams of morphine rates equivalents, which is the proxy for prescription rates, because if you have an NME rate of over 90, that's considered very dangerous and could get you addicted to opioid. Running the analysis with that kind of data is somewhat similar. A little better, but it's pretty similar, the interpretation. So for some reason, I'm finding that voters may be holding congresspeople more accountable for what happens, at least in terms of the opioid crisis, than governors, right? So there's still obviously a lot of work to do. I'm not sure that I will end up producing something meaningful. Hopefully I will. But I still need to collect data on electoral outcomes for local officials to see whether there's some sort of reaction to what mayors, for instance, can do in terms of opioid crisis. Develop causal mechanisms that could link each type of official to their handling of the opioid crisis. So for instance, drug arrests, it's a matter of debate, sort of, well, who exactly is making decisions to either go hard or go soft on drug crimes, right? Is it the Illinois State Police, and is it their court governor? If it is the feds, then is that a decision from the federal government, or are police officers
You're 10 minutes.
autonomous? Oh, sorry. Yeah, and then, well, I need to refine some control variables that could make these correlations that we talked about spurious. And then there's some references. And if you have any questions or feedback, either for now or if you come up with them later, I'll be grateful. Thank you.
Comments?
Yes.
So with the pharmaceutical companies having the, I guess the proposed impact to some of the states for the opioid crisis, I think they offered like 18 million.
Yeah.
Was Illinois included in one of those states?
Sorry?
Was Illinois one of the states who filed the lawsuit?
I'm not sure, but I think that offer is going to be rejected. But the last thing I read was that it was going to be rejected. I don't remember if Illinois was among the states that filed that lawsuit, but I wouldn't be surprised. Because even Republican states, this is actually led by some prosecutor in Kansas, I think, which is Republican. And so even them, who are considered to be more pro-business, are suing pharmaceutical companies. So I wouldn't be surprised if Illinois were also. Yeah.
This is more of a contextual question, but what area did you say has been like most affected by the opioid epidemic?
So within Illinois, well, these are actually changes in time, but usually what you see is higher shares, higher rates of overdoses in the south, in southern
Oh, okay.
around here.
And how have they voted?
Tradition. So this is also why looking at what the results for the government are could be sort of interesting, because if you usually find that Republicans tend to do better when the opioid crisis is worse, then what happens when the Republican governor tries to make that better? He's a Republican, but he's also the governor. So which way are the Senate going? To the voters.
My suggestion, because from what it sounds like, this is interesting in kind of the correlations that you're observing, but from the theoretical framing in which you were kind of suggesting like the supply side and the demand side, sort of this rational choice, but then later on with the retrospective voting perspective, I thought that was really useful. But I would suggest if some way somehow like including structural elements into any of your data measurements, such as like what are the funds that are distributed to rehab centers or like hospitals or like different kind of entities that would sort of ameliorate for people with opioid struggles.
Right.
So sort of taking a Durkheimian approach, because a lot of what you frame sounds sort of like this enemy type of crisis, and it's like the disintegration of society, right? That would be my suggestion.
That's what we usually think. I'm kind of trying to get information on access to medication. It could be sort of a proxy for regulations, maybe. Because there's free drugs that can be administered for people who are on opioids and are addicted, that will get them out of them.
Oh, wow.
And it's an interesting story because in some counties there appears to be a lot of resistance to having them, because there are differences between the free drugs and what they do, and some of them will basically make you addicted to another thing. And so some counties refuse to administer them. So that would be a good measure.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering if you consider like a relationship between public and private standpoint and amount of overdoses, because I would guess that the more privatized industry is, like the health industry is pretty privatized. Like there could be a supply side situation where you want to prescribe more drugs because you're making money off it.
Right. So you mean the health industry? To what degree?
Right. Like no, if you have like a candidate who's like maybe just a candidate or like the health industry in general, like how like degree of privatization impacts like overdose rate
But like privatization of what exactly?
of the healthcare
Hospitals?
industry,
Oh, okay,
of like healthcare.
yeah, sure, yeah, that would be interesting.
Is that something you?
Does that vary by county in Illinois or in the US?
I don't know.
No? Okay, no, but basically,
I don't know.
the big, again, the two big questions is very short in time. One, what's the correlation, the simple correlation? You really have two variables, voting and opioids. What's the correlation between the two? Simple.
Between the two,
Yeah.
it's what I've shown, which is really not good. It's about 0.1.
No, that's the Moran's eye, that's not
Well-
the Pearson correlation.
No, but what I'm trying to see is the spatial R correlation measures. So for one of the, so
Okay, but my simple
Yeah.
point is, it's low.
yeah, one of them is low, the other one is pretty good. It's moderate.
But related to, well, okay, if you use this is a Moran's eye, which is a little more complicated, but the simple idea is if you have a relationship like a Pearson R, which is a normal, when we say a correlation, that's a Pearson correlation. If you square the Pearson correlation, that's the shared variance.
Yeah.
And that's also called how much variance is explained by, say in this example, how much variation in the voting is explained by the opioids. And the answer is small to moderate. And what you've heard me say 20 times is race, class, gender, national origin, and age all together explain about 10 to 15%. Okay, this may be lower in Illinois because you've just got counties, so the N is low. If you take 3,000 counties for the US, it would go up a bit. But the simple point is you have not included most of the classic voting variables. You've omitted from the model the things which the main literature on voting includes.
No, I haven't. It's just that I don't have enough time. But I have included.
You tell the reader that first of all. And because in your review of the literature,
Yeah.
it's unclear if you're dealing with simple relations, how much the past literature dealt with simple relations or
Right.
multi-causal, and specifically what is controlled.
Right.
So I'd say that's the first thing to tell more than a very, very low level audience. That is, the normal reaction to everything which you did present is spurious. That is because there's so many other things going on. Not only race, class, gender, age, national origin, but also everything that was mentioned and possibly others. So telling the reader what you have and have not controlled is critical.
Right. Yeah.
And then how much does the whole model explain? And that's one of the big, and I'm making it a little more emphatically, even with a very talented presentation, because this is a big point in the course. What if anyone tells you, your mother or your grandmother or friend, this is A is the cause of B, what should be your first reaction? How many other things might also be there, and is what you've just mentioned really correlated with education? Is it correlated with income? Is it correlated with poverty? None of those are presented here, especially in the maps. I mean, the maps imply that opioids cause voting, but if you don't show and you can't, but the basic problem, you can't show that with maps. You need something like a regression model where you can show, as we've showed it simply with boxes and arrows, and have multiple boxes and arrows working all at the same time. So you don't need to know the fancy names of statistics, but everybody knows that there are many things going on simultaneously. And that's the main thing to ask about if you don't hear them mentioned. And then which specifically, how many. And that's the main problem with
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I should have thought of the presentation a different way, but I
Okay,
did.
we're over
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Do we have another presentation today? Okay, please do.
based on the results of the experiment, are there any directions of moving forward and to make this into a better and deeper project? So as I said in the name, I'm interested in whether the media portrayal of immigration impact the reader's immigration attitude. And I designed a survey experiment to test the hypothesis. So my two goals are to first theoretically, systematically test whether there is actually an impact of between the news article and the reader's attitude. And if there is an impact, whether each threat dimension portrayed is equally consequential to the change in immigration attitude. So, okay, so this is my my basic theoretical framework, which is framing theory. So in essence, it means that how something is presented to the audience influences the choices that people make about how to process the information. So based on this theory, I'm thinking of if, for example, I'm finding the readers with the negative impact in terms of economy of immigration, then it will impact their attitude towards immigration. So my pilot research is a between subject survey experiment, and I create news articles on the topic of safety, culture, and economics. And for each of these three topics, I designed 2 articles portraying positive and negative consequences, mirroring the images of one of them. I will give you an example. So this is the experimental design. You can see there are 3 topics, which are safety, culture, and economics, and related are the positive and negative attitudes. And there is a set of condition, which is a control group. The control group's topic has nothing to do with immigration, and is often neutral to all, and that's beautiful. So this is one example of the culture treatment. So the upper one is the positive portrait of the culture aspect of the economy, of immigration. And the lower one is the negative portrait of the cultural consequences of immigration. So they are mirroring each other, and I control the difference in the number of the paths into like 5 words between articles. And I made a regression model. Okay. So one thing it's very important, and I forgot to include this in my slide, which is after reading the article, I showed the respondents questions that is normally used to test people's immigration attitude, which is, in your mind, do you think the immigration flow in the United States should be present, increase, or decrease? This is the first question. I labeled it as immigration flow in my model. And the second one is, do you think immigration is a good thing or a bad thing? And the answer is good, bad, and mixed. So these are the 2 questions that is widely used by academia and also like Gallup research to test people's immigration attitudes. But later I will also discuss, their pros and cons of using that question. And so after I present them with the treatment, I asked them about the immigration attitude directly afterwards. So this is the result. Also in this in the model, I included, as Professor Clark said, race, political view, gender, age, and income. But it's like I don't have enough space to cover all the models, so I just included the one with the treatment. And you can see safety negative makes people less likely to favor an increased flow of immigration. And also culture positive make people both less likely to prefer an increased flow of immigrants and a decreased flow of immigration as well. And also culture negative makes people think immigration is a bad thing. And econ positive framing makes people think And to make it more clear, this is a table of predicted probability of answers to question 1, integration flow, and question 2 is integration of the thing or that thing. And you can see that if you compare is integration good, and if you compare the line after that thing, you can see that the impact of cultural narrative is really very significant. Like the other are like 10% or 5%, and for cultural narrative it's like more than 30% possibility. And also economics part of it, it makes people really think integration is a good thing. And so based on that, one of the major findings that kind of responded with cultural threat and positive economic consequences cues which it expressed opinions about immigration. So cultural threat makes people think of immigration as more likely to think of immigration as that thing, and positive economic consequences make them more likely to in favor of immigration. So that's just what I did. Yeah, and I interviewed 400, not interviewed, there are 400 respondents, and I got 395 answers. Yeah, and one thing I'm really concerned is that, like, for all the research that use MTurk, I think the external validity is a little bit difficult to justify, because people will say that your sample is not representative of the US population. Yeah, they're like relatively higher educated, so yeah, that's also a lot.
And MTurk can be used by anyone, right? It's international. It's not
Yeah, but
necessarily just
you can choose what respondents you want. I choose people that are in our cities. Sorry, I forgot to mention it. That's it.
Last comment I made was about direct effects. Here, I've raised the question of interaction effects. That is, how much might the answers differ if you're highly educated or low educated, or high, medium, low? That is, and I'm sure you've thought about this in read literature on it. But I don't see any way that you've addressed it empirically or in your hypothesis.
Sorry,
That is, the hypothesis in the quotation did not specify any difference according to, say, education or critical orientation of the respondent. Your very first quote at the beginning with your hypothesis said, the message will change the subject's answers.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say, it implies that all subjects are the same. And many social psychologists tend to imply that because they're not sensitive to sort of more general contextual variables. And so I'm teasing you a little here. You said briefly, very quickly, you controlled for some variables, but you didn't really tell us how do you control. And does control include interactions as well as additions in something like a regression? That's my question.
Yeah, actually, I didn't say that in the presentation, but I actually tried different models, and I used the most efficient one.
Good. Just a little slower and clearer. What did you control and how, I guess, is the simple question.
Oh, I include in a model, like the model that I present, the independent variables are the article, which is the treatment, and also race, political view, gender, age, and income.
But not education.
I tried education, but there is no big difference.
No big difference in terms of what?
In terms of the outcome of the general like efficiency and the statistics of the model.
So you ran a regression including education and then excluding education, and they were not different.
Yeah, I think one possible explanation for my case specifically is that if you see the demographic feature of my response,
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at is, do you see that, you know, are you familiar with the term with the concept of interaction
yeah,
in contrast to a direct effect? I've shown it on the board
yeah,
with an arrow, just for everybody to remind you briefly. You don't need to know fancy statistics, but you should all be conscious of the possibility of the concept. So if you have, let's say, opioids cause voting, or the message is more positive or more negative, does that change the dependent variable? And so you have the independent variable. So the first idea is it spurious? This is spurious. Spuriousness, question mark. The second idea is interaction. It's not, that is, if you include the variable, then it is not spurious, but the interaction may change the relative impact of opioids or education or income or the message which is included. And it sounds in both of your studies that you probably both have strong potential spuriousness and strong potential interaction effects. I mean, would that not seem normal to most of you here, that if you have highly educated USC students and you show them that little blurb from USA Today, is that going to change your whole view on immigration? And I mean, how many of you, I mean, just asking you, you were in a social experiment now. How many of you would have changed your view if you had one versus the other? I mean, in a sense, we're looking for concepts like robustness. How robust is a finding? That is, in life, lots of things may be true in one context, say in one conversation with one person, but then you repeat the same conversation with another person. You can get the opposite results. So so Converse did this in the same questionnaire, used the same questionnaire, and asked the same basic question at the beginning and the end of the questionnaire. 85% of Americans contradicted themselves in terms of should unions be stronger or weaker, basically. You know, fundamental aspect of the American New Deal had that. So my point is, this is not stuff to ignore, but to be sensitive to and to build into our research design in some way. So you've done that in part by including the other variables in the regression. But at least most people who do this ignore interaction effects. And I think from what you've said, you've ignored interaction.
yeah, I know.
Okay. So in the interaction effect in that, the simple idea is people who have, say, 4 years of education should answer differently than one of you who has 2 parents who have PhDs in physics and you're a USC student. Wouldn't you expect different answers from someone who has a hard time, you know, signing their own name? Okay, that's all.
Great, thank you.
All right. Quick comment.
How does that work with, do you explain the difference in why education is an interaction or a direct cause toward the direct variables, or the dependent variables?
Education could lead people to less often say, so education okay. One quick comment on education in most of the Western world tends to increase tolerance toward immigrants, toward people different from you. However, clearly, as you see in the Trump election, as you see in demonstrations after 9/11, we have big differences domestically. Different people support different candidates, and different people have different views about immigration. So, so why are those differences? what are those differences associated with the most important single variable which people generally talk about is education. And that implies interaction in the sense that not only may education have a negative impact on immigration attitudes, that is, less educated people are less tolerant, but that the degree to which the variable being studied here, the news story, one experimentally invoked USA Today story, changes the result. Okay. And that is likely to be less significant for people who have more education and who've been brought up in an environment with highly educated other persons. Okay. We have a third presentation today?
Yeah.
Okay, but please go ahead.
Well, this is my qualifying paper as part of my PhD program requirements. I thought about, for the benefit of this course, extend my paper to the global side of the story, how Chinese censorship is exported and modified via the global economic links, and how such practices are interpreted globally and locally. However, this paper is more on the local side of the story, analyzing how the overarching state censorship, what I call official censorship, influences more localized, corporate or private censorship, which is quite profitable for many media companies because they can use this ambiguity or uncertainty of state censorship to extort money or, coerce individuals or companies to pay. So I'm going to spend 1 minute on the abstract because it says everything. Then I'm going to show you the structure of this gray area where this market, in terms of the demand and supply side. Then I'm going to talk about the causal mechanism I argued in this paper, talking about the relationship between the state censorship and non-state censorship, and finally the discussion and one takeaway. So the existing literature on state censorship focuses on this overarching state censorship sanctioned by the state for political purpose. That's our conventional knowledge of censorship, but little attention has been paid to this so-called non-state censorship that individuals or corporations pursue out of material or career interests. So I'm going to use one case, Yahoo, a Beijing-based companies that search on the internet, coerce on individuals for money, and how they get the business done. So part of my paper is about documenting the existence of paid censorship as business in China and examining its demand and supply side. That's the structure of this gray area. And I will also analyze how this non-state censorship is enabled and normalized by the ambiguity and secrecy of China's official censorship regime, and how the decentralized and multi-layered nature of the system facilitates this sort of non-state censorship. So there are two causal mechanism arguments I made in my paper. One is about ambiguity and uncertainty. Another one is about this decentralized censorship regime in China. So the finding or the implication of the article is to show that neglecting this paid non-state censorship pursued by these actors not only would lead to the mistaken estimates of the size and motives of state censorship, but also an incomplete understanding of the corrosive consequences of state censorship. So one big takeaway from this paper is there is a paradox of this regime stability maintenance system. Part of the problem is the system itself. It creates some informal network of people who use this system to profit for themselves. So let's first have a taste of this sort of non-state censorship. There's a company called Yage. It's a Beijing-based firm specializing in deleting internet posts. The employees of this company will search on the internet for the negative news or posts about some potential clients. These clients are some government officials. They're mostly from local governments, and they won't get some piece of information deleted, particularly before the two important meetings in China in March. The two meetings, one is the National People's Congress, another is the Political Consultative Conference. So they want to get those news deleted because they are politically vulnerable at that time. So after the individuals or firms affected by the negative online content sign contract with this company, the company would typically use three means to delete, suppress, or block the negative information. For example, they can just delete the post through the connection to the internet police, or they can use some very technical term called internet optimization. They can just suppress some search results on the search engine. Or they can have some search company to delete some keywords on the search engine, for example, Baidu. There are some employees that are hired by those PR companies to help some individuals to block some key terms. So this is a very concrete case. So in order to have better understanding, I document, I basically summarize demand and supply side. Usually the demand side are government officials and celebrities and companies who want to get their piece of information deleted from the internet or from the media. The supply side are more interesting. It's about 5-layer. It's about this complex in here, but basically they include officials at the regional propaganda departments, officials in the central regulatory bodies, the highest decision-making bodies on censorship and speech restriction. Internet police, these are very interesting species. They have jurisdictional and territorial management. So sometimes they have to ask other web police from other provinces to get piece of information deleted. So this is a very interesting dynamic, because in China we know that the system, the authoritarianism is not monolithic. It's quite fragmented, and some very complex tasks should be managed on a territorial or jurisdictional base. And there are some individual journalists. They can use their editing or reporting power to extort money, and they can use this ambiguity of the censorship to go to the local government for dropping some negative news in return for some money. There are some media outlets, and there are some website operators. So this graph shows this complexity, on the supply side. There are top censorship apparatuses. So all these data are collected from some news coverage or public investigation reports. Some of them are confirmed by some interviewees. I've done several interviews over the years with some journalists, media editors, and some media scholars as well. So this is the top censorship apparatus, including the CCP propaganda departments and other. So the left side is about media side. The right side is the internet apparatus. So at the corporate level, you have news organization, and on the internet side, you have internet content providers. the most interesting side is interesting layer is the extension. These are all the actors outside the supposed censorship actors, but they can all come in and take a share for this gray area. They include public relations firms, local informants. They have some news. They can use that news to coerce people to pay. There are some low-level officials with media contacts and lawyers, legal scholars, actors, and all use the system for their own benefits. So the most interesting causal mechanism, causal argument I make in the paper is these two. First is about how this ambiguity or secrecy of state censorship normalize this non-state censorship. So I'm trying to argue that there is a causal mechanism between the two, and there are three layers of argument I made in that part. The first one is the censorship directives and instructions are very ambiguous, vague, and ad hoc. We don't have reports to ask for the intention of the censorship. Basically, this is on-the-job deletion directive from the higher up. Secondly, you don't have a list of sensitive words to be blocked. Media companies themselves are left to compile their own list of sensitive words. And most importantly, in China, there's no press law, and it's intentionally delayed because there are some very important standing committee guide talking about the strategy of this ambiguity. My second causal argument is how this decentralization of state censorship facilitates this private censorship or corporate censorship. So there are lots of cases support my analysis. The idea is the task of censorship is enormous, so complicated, and it needs to delegate to lower levels to finish the job. And this decentralized censorship also blurs the responsibility. So in this case, many actors can make use of the system, and there are lots of cases that I use to support this phenomenon. So the discussion are also about the findings. Basically, we have to get the paper tries to document this forgotten or ignored side of the censorship. So without such knowledge, we probably would underestimate the size and the scope of the censorship. And secondly, I try to argue the mechanism between these two different kinds of censorship. So finally, the takeaway is there is a paradox of the Chinese state stability management system. And censorship is seen as something that can stabilize the regime. But in this case, it causes lots of problems that can, in a way, subvert the governance of Chinese state. So that's one big takeaway. So this is the paper already. So I probably should have talked about my next step, talking about the global side of the censorship when it travels abroad, how it gets reacted, what sort of resistance it faces. But this is more on the local side. So I would like to hear your questions or anything.
So I understand how you're saying, okay, the authoritarian government in China is fragmented because they're relying on these different layers of people to kind of take ownership of censorship. But you're also arguing that their reliance on this like multi-layered system is subverting their authority.
Yeah, the quality of governance.
Yeah.
The Chinese government is using all sorts of, e-governance, Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, to, to not only maintain the system, but also to find out some problems that are often covered up at a lower level of authority.
Yeah.
But in this case, I find this cover up at the lower level,
Yeah.
and sometimes the lower level operator can network with people at the higher level, even at the central regulatory body in charge of the censorship or speech restriction. There are some very high up officials being tried because of corruption case. So there are some conclusive public investigation on these people. So what I'm trying to say is this multi-layer system creates multiple entry points for people even outside of this censorship operation, including lawyers, fake journalists, and PR companies. So this is very corrosive, and it's not just about political censorship now, it's corruption, and it's enabled and normalized by the state censorship.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Anyone else? This is the opposite of the first two. That is, they had clear, simple, maybe too simple hypotheses and tests. This is very complicated, very subtle, very contextual, discussed, and very difficult to capture what's the independent, what's the dependent variable, and all of these. So congratulations on identifying, but this is also, all three of these are very big, popular, policy debated issues. In censorship and corruption more generally, corruption is probably the biggest single issue in local politics in the entire world. Latin America, Africa, as well as Washington, D.C. with Trump, etc. So corruption, and what is corruption and how should it be? I mean, this is major, and so what you've done is move beyond the normal. On the other hand, almost everything we've discussed is inside China. So how can you get a handle on how strong this is and how is it working and what's making it, is it spurious? I mean, the big question is it really spurious? And you seem to have some compelling evidence that people are actually collecting money, they're deleting these. I mean, so clearly there's at least some examples that this kind of censorship and punishment and corruption, bribing, and so forth is going on. But how big is it? Because you have some bits of this everywhere in the world. So one simple thing would be to try to see how much of some of these things can you find also, say, in Taiwan or Korea or Japan, that other Asian countries that are relatively close in general cultural style, in terms of generally they respect authority, they have a more Confucian traditional religious background, they respect the elderly, they respect authority more than people do in the West. And so if you control those to varying degrees, or if there are ways of finding this inside China, if you could find certain cities or regions within China where this is stronger or weaker, then that would be a way of giving more evidence in support of this. Because as it now stands, it's sort of everywhere it's going on in China, and no doubt it is, but how much is it, how wide, and what the drivers are, you really can't tell, at least from the kinds of evidence that you've been able to introduce so far. But I would still applaud it, and as you mentioned, yeah, I mean, lots more to do, but this is your beginning parts of a PhD, so terrific. look forward to more. Any last question or comment? Okay, do we have any more presentations for today? No, okay. So I will get started a little bit, and given that we've got 20 minutes left, I'll start a little bit talking about social movements in context, and to try to link with what we've heard. Let me introduce this with something specifically on China. I'm drawing this if it's easy to put it here, sure. I'm sort of introducing the topic, and I'll continue next time. But I want to introduce a bit. This is a story from this serious social science research source called the New Yorker magazine. Literary, public-oriented, sensitive, and this story is called "Fight, Fight, Talk, Talk: The Future of Americans' Contest with China" by a reporter at large, Evan Osnos, O-S-N-O-S. Okay, so he goes through lots of discussion of Chinese cultural activities, but then he includes some interviews with other people about this. And this is an interview with her name is X.I. After high school, she returned to the U.S. She was born in Pittsburgh and raised in Maryland. I grew up in a suburb with other lawyers and professors' kids. In 2003, when she was 14, the family moved to Beijing. So she was Chinese in background. She moved back to Beijing at age 14. Her mother became a professor at Peking University, and Xu entered a prestigious middle school where she caught up in learning and reading to write Chinese. Okay, she returned to the U.S. to attend Harvard. She sang in an a cappella group and re-embraced American life. In her application, she described wanting to be a U.S.-China bridge who might benefit and bring the countries closer together. Everybody was like, oh, this is great, she said. She loved Harvard, where she majored in political science, but a tone in her classes surprised her. My sophomore tutorial was termed Democracy, and it was basically a whole year of every famous professor coming in and giving a lecture about why democracy is the only legitimate form of government. Okay. So then she moved back to Beijing in 2012 and eventually started working as a co-producer between Chinese and American filmmakers. It was like, oh, this is the future. The two greatest countries producing culture together. Her optimism has since waned. It has become pretty clear in the last few years that the Hollywood-China co-production is not a thing. It still happens financially. It just doesn't happen creatively. So she goes by a critique of that one example, but then she wants to be bicultural, but still finds it increasingly difficult to combine both sets of values. Quote, all my friends who are similar to me in Beijing, in every one of our industries, U.S.-China is not a thing anymore. We're basically just seen as just China people now. Xu told me she is pro-China, and I asked her what she meant. Most people who are within the sphere of the West kind of reflexively look at China and say, oh wow, totalitarian dictatorship, oppression of human rights, no suffering, just evil, right? To be pro-China is simply to realize that that's not right. There is much more going on. It's not perfect, but it's not simply just an alternative system. she went on, I would say that the ideals of human rights are not bad to aim for, but it's not a universal. That's the big point. Now, I want to say a few words about that as well. The human rights theme, as this course is cross-listed with human rights. It's not a God-given thing. It was something that was consensus-driven at a certain point in Western history. If you look at Chinese social progressivism, things are genuinely getting better for most people, despite the problems. It's more a battle of narratives about values. Okay, so just 2 words maybe on human rights. How many of you had a course where someone lays out sort of the history of the human rights perspective of the so-called regime of human rights? Anybody? That is, okay, because I've asked this of, yeah, tell us what you've had.
Well, there are like 3 like human rights lecture, human rights case in Chicago. It's like start with human rights history, then the Philosophical Foundation, and some like contemporary like issues. And I took the human rights history and Philosophical Foundation courses, and the history one was like maybe about like American foreign policy in 1970, and something about like post-Second World War international order establishment, and the contemporary ones are maybe like American-based non-governmental organizations. Yeah, basically.
Okay. This is very helpful, and this directly fits with my brief overview of some of this. That is, one homework bit that I did was to talk with a friend who's about my age. He worked in the U.S. Foreign Service, and he worked at the United Nations at the time that the human rights, some of the major human rights activities were being put into law by the United Nations. But so then he now has been in Washington. He's a leader in sort of Friends of the United Nations, and he goes around the U.S. and meets at colleges with nonprofits, etc., to sort of promote human rights and the United Nations more generally. So I said to him, I'm teaching a course on global local politics, and I said, how and why does human rights work in ways that we can talk about it outside the U.S.? If you are in, if you're dealing with Genghis Khan, if you're dealing with Mao, if you're dealing with Stalin, how can you talk about human rights in a way that's meaningful in a non-U.S. context? And he basically said, it is built for the U.S. context. That the main source was the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who developed this around 1946, and it then became passed by the United Nations by many of the countries, but it was opposed by, I think, Russia and China at the time. And the classic Chinese argument from the 40s onward has basically been economic position, GNP per capita wealth and income are part of human rights. So if you don't have improving economic well-being, especially in poor countries, it is irresponsible to talk about freedom of the press and these other kinds of things. Okay, so that has been a powerful, so there have been debates going on over this since the 1940s, initially in the U.S., but I'm interested that your course dealt with this as U.S. foreign policy and not dealing with it from within, let's say, Brazil's perspective, from within China's perspective. So in that sense, I'm bringing you the quotations of this woman who was trying to be bicultural, and she ended up basically despairing and saying people are, both within China, but especially within the U.S. and the West, are trying to see the world in terms of simple black and white dichotomies, of trying to at least have the ideal of human rights is, as I'm suggesting, is highly Western and highly American in that sense. And the battles within the UN, and the answer via my friend is basically within the UN, there's a new version of this called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have 3 or 4 ways of trying to sanction, assess, evaluate, score human rights. And that's initially the general 1940s version, and then there's the more universal version that came later on. But basically, these are all fairly open and subjective, and so I followed up. Are there any books? Are there any things which one could use in courses like this course, which would come from the perspective outside the West, especially, to try to get? I mean, so I mentioned briefly Russian films that the Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible were commissioned by Stalin because he wanted to build support among the Russian people to fight in World War II. Okay, so in a sense, is that where and how do the dynamics outside the West operate? And so in that sense, I applaud the effort to try to deal with corruption in that sense. But I mean, I've studied Chicago. I mean, you've heard me talk more about the international part. I've had some Chicago examples. And I've been doing an oral history with people on Chicago since Harold Washington was elected in the 1980s. So we've talked to hundreds of people. We've gone, I personally, Bill Grimshaw and Jackie Grimshaw, who I started with, who were campaign managers of Harold Washington. We got entree to all kinds of people, and so we've conducted interviews with all sorts of people involved in this, as have many, many students. I've read 50, 60 student papers dealing with different aspects of these issues, looking for new twists. Corruption is very complicated to study. Call it clientelism, call it corruption, call it, I mean, as many different names and labels and so forth. But it's much harder to capture with the standard public, straightforward survey research or experimental or other kinds of methodologies which are considered generally more rigorous in the social sciences, because of so many complicated things of this sort, which you heard in Alan's presentation about China. That is, some of this is going on in Chicago. And Chicago is a great case because it's been the most. I mean, this is Al Capone City. You travel around the world, people say, "Where are you from?" Say Chicago. Say, "Oh, you know." So Al Capone is the Chicago image. Maybe Michael Jackson. Maybe Harold Washington, maybe a little bit of other things, but Al Capone is still the foundation. We're the gangster city, and the gangsters succeeded. Al Capone succeeded because of the mayor. Mayor Big Bill Thompson said, "Sure, Al, give me some of your money, and I'll let you operate in some areas of the city, and we can work together." And they did. So in that sense, and so the end of Al Capone and the end of Mayor of Thompson was the 1933 election with the beginning of the New Deal, which ironically was brought here by the political machine. So the old corruption was replaced by the 1933 onward Chicago political machine, which is the biggest, toughest, and many say the most corrupt political organization in the city in the United States. Okay, so given that. This is a great place to study and to talk with people about how this kind of stuff works. But they will immediately, I mean, average Chicagan will, they'll go through 15 ways that, you can buy votes, you can do this and that and so forth. So let's just look briefly with a little bit of time at one of these. This is in part because this is so elementary. See, are we plugged in with the sound?
In Congress as part of the demonstration against corporate greed and high unemployment.
Yes, he said Ellen Holmes here with more on the next steps of the protest was going.
Robin Karen, members of the Occupy Chicago will say they don't even devote confrontation, but wish to use civil disobedience to inform the public about their movement. Still, about 175 protesters were arrested after they set up a makeshift tent city in Grant Park. Similar groups nationwide have established bases in city parks, with officials are often working to accommodate them. But not here in Chicago.
Just hours after nearly 200 members of Occupy Chicago are arrested, the group vows to keep their protest alive.
Well, it's for sure that we're going to continue our occupation here on LaSalle and Jackson for an indefinite period of time.
Supporters say the early morning arrest of group members as they demonstrated marked a new phase of civil disobedience for the movement.
The only thing that will change is if there's a change in the mass consciousness of the average American. The average American realizes things I'm talking about, which are basically the facts.
The arrest, which began around 2 a.m., came after protesters tried to camp out in Grant Park without a permit. That followed a march of some 2,000 demonstrators. They refused to take down tents and leave the area. Organizers admit not seeking a permit to be in the park, which closed at 11 o'clock at night.
Okay. This is, around the world, this is not news. I mean, you've seen this in Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, Ukraine, lots of these kinds of demonstrations. If we look for little bits of differences, even if they were briefly mentioned here, 175 protests around the world. I was not quite sure if that around the world or the U.S., but there could well have been 175 in the U.S. only. Only in Chicago were they arrested in this way. So the Chicago police has a distinct reputation from Daily One onward of being tough on protesters. And Chicago was the biggest Catholic city, which has a tradition of not having graffiti, of having mayor's graffiti blasters, they're called. So in Chicago, the city government goes around and erases graffiti in ways that make Chicago look much cleaner, if you will. But this is the opposite of what you have in most world cities. Frankfurt, I mean, especially the German cities, where they're very afraid, as you know, of having a strong authoritarian reputation. You take a train from Frankfurt for 200 miles, every single little station, every single bit of white wall is covered with graffiti. They don't erase the graffiti, and etc., and they're very tolerant of all kinds of things. And Germany then welcomed more immigrants than any other country in the world, in Europe, let's say in Europe, and it was part of the guilt, in a sense, that the Germans have, where they're trying to okay, so Chicago in that sense is okay, so I won't try to go into too much detail except to show these kinds of variations. But the background for this is, why are people demonstrating? Why do we have the emergence of what are called new social movements or social movements in the 1970s in the West? Western Europe, the US, these exploded. Why did they explode in the 1970s? And the simple answer is because the political parties did not address these issues. Especially the left political parties, the Communists, the Socialists, the Democratic Party in the US, the Labour Party in England, left these out of their party programs. So students, people within a particular group, and these included women, environmentalists, sustainability, human rights, and then later on, LGBTQ. These kinds of issues were ignored by the political parties, and leaders of these groups, and there's been a study of this on the Italian and German, went to the political leaders and said, won't you include these issues in your communist and your socialist parties? And in Germany and Italy, the communist and socialist parties said, no way, we represent the proletariat. Working class people are our base. And what did the groups, especially what did the social movement groups do in Germany and Italy? They started with stuff like this, and when then it was much more toughly treated, and basically the activists became terrorists. They kidnapped political leaders. So what you described in China, The activist groups were doing it, not to make, they were not driven by money. They were driven by feminism. They were driven by human rights. They were driven by the environment, these are especially environmentalists. They captured political leaders. They killed professors. They dynamited trains. They killed hundreds of people over several years. There was an Olympics, in Germany that was particularly difficult. Then what happened? The socialists and communist parties said, you know, we need you. These are real issues and people are citizens, general citizens are taking them seriously. Please come into our parties and be part of it. And then what happened? No more terrorism. So violence in that sense was a means to bring attention, and it succeeded. So what this did was to add the concept of opportunity structure, and I'll talk more about that next time. But think about the example, and think of other examples, and of the context within which the kind of causal modeling that I'm showing you operates. And then how can we conceptualize and then measure the context as well as the processes? Okay, thank you folks. Thank you.